So walking around the side of this, you can see again we have our really nice stainless steel GM Performance shorty headers. Look how thick those flanges are. That looks like at least ½ inch to me, and they are cut for stress relief. We are running a full-size hydraulic. That's a liquid-filled engine mount. These are our bolt-in easy mounts, so there's no fabrication. This is an 8L90 transmission. Now the 8L90 transmission comes with this hole here, just like a 6L80. So what we do is we install a filler tube. These transmissions do not come with a filler tube. You're supposed to use a J-hook style tool to fill it up through the bottom, but we find this is much more convenient. So in our builds we include that too. Make sure you run this stud-headed bolt. If you don't and you tighten this down, it's going to pop that out of the seal, that hat seal, and you're going to have a problem. The 8L90 and the 10L90 do not have the transmission control module built into the valve body like the 6L80 does. So when you plug this in, essentially your internal mode switch, all your solenoids, park neutral stuff is in this transmission, and they are sending hard signals to the TCM, which in this case is a T87 or a T87A, and the 8L90 and the 10L90 both run the T87 style controller for the transmission. So then that TCM, that T87, communicates with the Gen 5 ECM, which is an E92, over the CAN network. Just like in the old days, the Gen 4 controllers did not have the ability to run the transmission like the Gen 3s. If you remember the LS1B and the LS1A computers, they were PCMs, powertrain modules. They did the transmission and the engine. In Gen 4s, they went to just an ECM. So they had to have a separate TCM that interfaced with the transmission and then communicated with the ECM. And that's exactly what the 8-speed and the 10-speed does. You can see that we have both our transfer case vent and our transmission vent, and we run it right up to the top of the dipstick tube, which seems to be fine. If you're got water over that point, you're probably in trouble because your tipman's underwater. You notice that on this build we did install our heat shield for the transmission. Make sure you do that if you're going to be running any kind of a, well, even if you got a V6. I've seen these things. You can notice this guy does have skid plates. We're probably going to put them back on. I've seen V6s melt these plastic fuel tanks. You can tell if you got a 4-door or a 2-door tank by looking at this here. This is long wheelbase. If this wasn't a 4-door, it wouldn't say LWB. Now we are running, this is our chassis harness, and we have this connector that goes up against the GM chassis connector. We've got one O2 sensor, we have our fuel tank pressure sensor, and our evap vent solenoid. And this is how GM does it. They actually separate the chassis from the body. So we mimic exactly what GM does. This is a completely stock JK fuel tank fuel pump assembly. On the LT1s, we don't mod them like we do with the LT4s. We find it's not necessary. On most of our builds, we don't mod them, like on the Gen 4s and the lower power LTs, because they don't need that 75 PSI like the LT4 does. The LT4 actually has all new guts inside. It has a different pump, and it's a lot of work. Now, this customer did relocate his evap canister before it got here. You will notice that this has the fuel tank pressure sensor, so we know this is a Pentastar JK. This is our fuel tank pressure sensor, and we've been running this since the very beginning. And GM has a much more sophisticated evap system that uses a closed loop feedback setup, and it uses this to tell it what the pressure is. Then it uses a vent valve to vent, and this is going to go out up into the body. There's this connection here. So this is going to be our muffler or our vent for the evap. This is our fill tube, and that's our fuel inlet breather, which, as we discussed, controls the fill valve inside of here. Now, if this breaks and you can fix it, that's great. But if this, we've seen these melted and other problems, if this gets damaged, you're pretty much screwed. He's not running a stock axle, as you can tell. That thing is monster. And if you replace the axle or put a lift on, make sure you extend the hose going down to the axle. I've seen more than once where the axle droops, unplugs the vent, and then water gets into the differential and you destroy it at that point. It looks like he's got some pneumatic hose going here throughout the vehicle. And this is common. We see a lot of guys do this in our builds. But the good thing is when you pull the body, you don't have to change anything on the bumpers, tire carriers, winches, etc. Tires and axles can stay in place. This is your tire pressure monitoring system module. Most JKs have it in the later years. Again, you will notice on this build that we have not taken out any of the tire carriers, bumpers. He's obviously got a air tank back here. Again, another build with metal cloak suspension. He's actually got the 6-pack shocks on this. In comparison, here's a good old 6-liter build that we're doing. This would be more of a budget build. We've got a 6L80 transmission. We've got an iron blocked 6-liter engine, which is an excellent engine. This engine has variable valve timing, but no active fuel management. You can see we got our billet alternator bracket on. This is our billet air conditioning compressor block plate. Now, there's going to be another bracket on top of that, and then the compressor is going to mount to it. This is our billet power steering bracket, and you notice it runs the stock JK tensioner. We're running the stock JK power steering lines, and we will be running the stock JK air conditioning lines. So that's a pretty neat setup for the Gen 4s that we have. These manifolds work great. These older Trailblazer manifolds with the shields, they don't put a lot of heat out, they're quiet, and they have a relatively large opening and a 3-bolt flange for good sealing. Again, you can see that even though this is a 6L80, we've got this transmission fill tube, but we're running the studded bolt here so we don't pull that tube out of the hat seal. This is our standard transfer case adapter, our heavy duty transfer case adapter. You will notice we're running this heavy duty dual stud GM transmission mount. There is another transfer case adapter that's about 3/4 or an inch shorter than this that we use in some 2-door builds to get more drive shaft length, but this is the one we recommend. You can control the height by these bushings, and we include these in the kit. You can see that the plates are slotted front to rear and side to side, so you got a lot of versatility. You can run a 4-speed transmission or an 8-speed transmission or a 6-speed transmission with the same plate. We did eliminate, a lot of guys ask me, we did eliminate the bottom transmission plate years ago for several reasons. A lot of guys just weld these. This is a cold rolled 1/4 inch, and we've never seen one bend. So that, combined with the fact the later JKs actually have this come out and this cross member extends back to about here, means that we didn't need the lower anymore. So if you're going to weld it on, if you want the lower, we have them, but I don't think you need it. I wouldn't recommend it. Now, the 6L80 has what they call a dry adapter. So the back of this transmission, if I can get in here, is sealed. I don't know if you can see that. There's a seal back there. And the front of the transfer case is also sealed. So that means this is a dry adapter. You bolt it on and you're done. With the 8L90, that's not true. Let's walk over to an 8L90. With the 8L90, this is a stock GM 4-wheel drive transfer case adapter, and you will notice that the seal is inside that adapter. So there's an O-ring in here sealing it. So we can't just remove this or the fluid's going to come out. So we have an adapter plate, which I'll show you in another vehicle, that clocks the transmission properly. This is the 8L90 style transmission cooler line. You'll notice that we have an abbreviated shifter cable bracket, and that's because this is going to get an Atlas, so we're going to run the Atlas cables, not our standard setup. You will see this cooler down here on the LT1 that's going to be removed, and we're going to put a billet aluminum adapter plate that's going to bring some cooler lines out, and then we run an external cooler on the LT1. Do you have to run it? No, but this guy's going to be running big tires and axles and all that, so we're going to run our rail cooler on the driver's side on this LT1, and we're probably going to run our transmission cooler on the other side. This is our breather. This is our MAP, or manifold absolute pressure sensor. Here's our fuel inlet. You will notice there's no low pressure sensor on this LT1 build. Guys, if you're going to run wires, run good ones. These are GM or AC Delco wires, and they have these shields on them. They run a lot longer if you run these shields on them. We always use new Delco starter motors or GM starter motors. We learned our lesson many years ago about trying to go cheap on starter motors. These are gear driven, and they're high performance starters, and these are high compression engines. Again, this engine's 11.5 to 1 compression. It still amazes me. But using this continuous variable valve timing means we can harness the energy of that compression ratio, and when you combine it with the direct injection, it's just an awesome, phenomenal combination. So this is running an 8-speed. I'm not sure what this build is. This is another LT4 build with an 8-speed. He got a 10-speed in this one. This is an L86 with an LT1 intake on it. This is an LT1 that we're finishing, and this Jeep has a ton of accessories on it. lots and lots of wiring on top, inside, underneath, everywhere. So it really did add to the build time. You can see he's got a lot of stuff up front here, not just the winch, but lights and stingers and grill inserts. And we don't recommend these guys because it'll create a high pressure bubble here where the air is just going to hit it and go over. And you notice that he's got dual batteries. Looks like he's got the Genesis tray. Here's our coolant overflow bottle. We are running a K&N filter in this. We can also run the Spectre. We've got our PSC reservoir because we got hydraulics, and this is what they call their anti-splash valve, which is really nothing more than a pressure valve that holds a few psi to keep the fluid from aerating and puking out here, which is something that I think they've needed for a long time. But I think you can see how well the LT1 fits. There's been no modifications to the battery. There's been no modifications to the firewall. Now this one looks a little bit crowded because he's got all sorts of stuff in here, and it took a long time to clean up a lot of these wires. But at the end of the day, the LT1 fits in the JK like a glove. It's all bolt-in. There's no modifications to the frame or the chassis. He's running some pretty massive tie rod and drag links in this vehicle. And guys, make sure you center your axle and make sure that the pivot point of your drag link matches the pivot point of your track bar, both front and rear, and that way you'll avoid torque scare. This has got a variable rate spring in it, as you can tell. He's got some speed bumps in here. He's got a lot of stuff going on in this Jeep. It should be pretty awesome with the LT1, and the LT1 won't care about the weight. If you look at this Jeep roof rack, probably got a bunch of stuff inside, I'm guessing. Roll bar, oh yeah, look at all this stuff. This LT1 just won't care. It doesn't matter how heavy this Jeep is. It doesn't matter that it's got 39 or 40 inch tires. The LT1 will pull this thing like a go-kart. A lot of you guys ask, well, what's going on with your Jeep? Well, here it is, the guinea pig, and the single module system has been in this Jeep for over a year, and we've refined it to the point that we've got the minimum wire count, the minimum module count. This is actually a very amazing Jeep, and this Jeep has full traction control. All the factory Jeep switchgear, like the traction controller ESP button, all the dash functions like miles per gallon, all functional. So we're rationalizing that single module system for release this summer. Here's another LT1. I don't remember. Oh, I do remember the specifics on this. This is a local guy and relatively heavy Jeep. He's got some funky suspension on it. I think he's got a, he's got a 3-link on this one, and it was pretty roly-poly. We're gonna stay with it. We're gonna see how this thing works with. And again, this is a 10-speed, guys. This is a 10 L90 transmission, and it should pull this heavy JK with no problem. And here you go. You disconnect that steering shaft, take your brake components, set them off to the side, power steering, set it off to the side. Now again, this guy put a skid plate on. You can see somebody made an attempt to shield the fuel tank. I do believe this vehicle has full skids. We're of course going to restore this. This is one of the things I don't like about some of these aftermarket skids, is they remove the factory shielding. And I had a guy had a turbocharger with a V6, and they removed the factory shielding and put full skids on it, and he melted his tank, and actually gas was dripping out of it. So we're going to have to restore this. Not only put our L bracket on, but bring this forward where it should be. This Jeep looks like it was back east. We can tell by some of the rust that's on it. Actually, I think this customer is from Atlanta or the Georgia area, and you can see the toll that the corrosion back there takes in a JK, and it's one of the things that we have to take into account when we get into it. Now look here, I told you it was roly-poly. I drove this thing and it was a little bit scary, and I think you can see why. This sway bar has not been installed properly. It's not working properly. It looks yeah, look at that. It's all bent up, and that's going to have to be fixed before we give this thing back to the customer, because when you get 500 horsepower, and I'm calling the LT1 500 horsepower, especially with a 10-speed, because the torque of these things is just a monster. And not only is it monster torque, but when you combine it with a transmission that has diversity of this 10-speed transmission, it's phenomenal. It's nothing like the old 5 speeds, 4 speeds, and I'm going to even say the 6-speed. I mean, the 6-speed 6L80 is still an excellent transmission, But when you drive a 10-speed or a 8-speed with large tires, it does make a difference. With the smaller tires, not so much. We got hydraulic steering on this. We got some beefy components. Looks like his drag link boot's ripped. We'll have to see if there's any play in that. Ball joints are always a big concern. It looks like they did some kind of camber offset there. Stock JK is running some pretty junky ball joints, and when you put some bigger tires on, they wear out really quick. So get some quality ball joints. And these C's need to be strong with a V8. You get a lot more torque than you had with a little V6. So if you upgrade your axle, make sure that these C's are beefed up, or if you have stock axles, you can actually have them beefed up. And again, I think you can see how loose these tie rods are, or these sway bar links are, and that allows this thing, especially with a 3-link, to get roly-poly. Now, this winch is not sunk properly, as you can see. Here's your airflow into this vehicle. I think you can see that with this LED bar and this winch, we don't have a whole lot of cooling air, and we're going to have to address that. So I've rambled enough today. There is so much stuff going on in our shop right now. It's going to take many videos to cover it all, but we'll get there. So hopefully these little tech tips are going to help you out. And if you have any comments, put them down in the comment section, and I'll try to answer your questions. I just noticed that this guy has this is Redneck Ram, which basically uses a stock gearbox, and they port it. If you ever port your box, try to have them port it for a V8, where it takes this one here and it puts it up here, so that it's not going to go into an air compressor or whatever. Now, we're okay on this one because it's an LT, but if this was an LS and we had an air compressor here, it might have been a problem. Redneck Ram is a good alternative to the more costly power steering systems. So with a Redneck Ram, you're basically running a stock pump, stock reservoir, all that. And it's marginal with heavy 40s, especially in a parking lot when you're cranking on the wheel. Obviously, it's working for this guy. But if you're going to be running 40s, you're probably going to want to step up. Now, one thing that you want to consider is running a 5-inch pulley. If you got big tires, the smaller the pulley you run in the power steering pump, the more you overdrive it. PSC, for example, offers a 5-inch and a 6-inch. And if you have smaller tires, I recommend the 6-inch. That way you're not aerating the fluid. If you're running 40s, get the smaller pulley. And this cap on the stock power steering reservoir actually has a valve in it that mimics the anti-splash valve that PSC offers. So it does seal the system quite well. I'm happy with the way that these work. So we'll see how the steering is when we're done with it, but it's going to be basically the same as it was before. For some of you guys plumbing your LTs, you're going to have 2 vents, one here, one on the other side, and they're going to come forward. They're going to tee into the air intake tube that we supplied you with. This is